Question 1. Implementation of a new trading strategy at PACS Group has been proposed by a key institutional client. The client, who has significant holdings in a particular listed company, requests that PACS Group execute a series of large, prearranged trades designed to significantly move the stock price upwards just before the client plans to sell their entire stake. The client believes this will maximize their exit value. Option A. PACS Group should attempt to find an indirect method to achieve the client's desired price movement, perhaps by suggesting smaller, staggered trades that are less obviously coordinated. Option B. PACS Group should refuse the client's request without providing any specific regulatory reasons, citing only internal policy limitations. Option C. PACS Group should proceed with executing the trades as requested by the client, assuming the client is acting in their own best interest and that the firm is merely facilitating their investment strategy. Option D. PACS Group should explain to the client that their request cannot be fulfilled as it may constitute market manipulation and is therefore contrary to FCA regulations, specifically the Market Abuse Regulation, MAR, and relevant conduct of Business Sourcebook, COBS, provisions. The correct answer is D. PACS Group should explain to the client that their request cannot be fulfilled as it may constitute market manipulation and is therefore contrary to FCA regulations, specifically the Market Abuse Regulation, MAR, and relevant conduct of Business Sourcebook, COBS, provisions. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's explicit instructions and the firm's regulatory obligations. PACS Group, as a regulated entity, must prioritize compliance with the Financial Conduct Authority, FCA handbook, specifically the Conduct of Business Sourcebook, COBS, and the Market Abuse Regulation, MAR, over client demands that could lead to non-compliance or market abuse. The firm's duty is to act in the best interests of clients, but this duty is circumscribed by the overarching requirement to uphold market integrity and adhere to regulatory frameworks. Misinterpreting or disregarding these regulations can lead to significant reputational damage, regulatory sanctions, and financial penalties. The correct approach involves politely but firmly explaining to the client that their request cannot be fulfilled due to regulatory restrictions. This demonstrates professionalism by prioritizing compliance and client protection within the legal framework. Specifically, the firm must identify the potential for market abuse or insider dealing, as outlined in MAR, and the obligation under COBS to ensure that advice and transactions are suitable and in the client's best interest, which includes not facilitating potentially illicit activities. By refusing the request and explaining the regulatory basis for this refusal, PACS Group upholds its ethical and legal responsibilities. An incorrect approach of proceeding with the client's request without proper due diligence or regulatory consideration would constitute a severe breach of FCA regulations. This could be interpreted as facilitating market abuse or insider dealing, violating MAR and COBS. Another incorrect approach, that of simply refusing without explanation, while avoiding direct regulatory breach, fails to educate the client and maintain a professional relationship, potentially leading to client dissatisfaction and future misunderstandings. A third incorrect approach, attempting to find a loophole or an indirect way to fulfill the request, is ethically dubious and highly risky, as it could still be construed as circumventing regulations and could lead to similar regulatory sanctions as a direct violation. Professionals should approach such situations by first identifying the core regulatory principles at play. They must then assess the client's request against these principles, seeking clarification if necessary. If a conflict arises, the professional's duty is to communicate the regulatory limitations clearly and professionally, offering alternative, compliant solutions where possible. This decision-making process prioritizes integrity, compliance, and client welfare within the established legal and ethical boundaries. Question 2. Strategic planning requires PACS Group to establish clear protocols for handling potentially suspicious client transactions. If a client, who is a long-standing and high-value customer, initiates a transaction that triggers internal red flags for potential money laundering, what is the most appropriate and compliant course of action for the PACS Group employee to take? Option A. Ignore the red flags and proceed with the transaction, assuming it is a misunderstanding due to the client's long-standing relationship. Option B. Immediately report the suspicious transaction to the relevant regulatory authority as per internal policy and AML regulations. Option C. Conduct an independent, informal investigation into the client's background without informing the compliance department or the regulator. Option D. Contact the client directly to seek clarification on the transaction's purpose before taking any further action. The correct answer is B. Immediately report the suspicious transaction to the relevant regulatory authority as per internal policy and AML regulations. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for PACS Group employees due to the inherent conflict between client confidentiality and the need to comply with regulatory reporting obligations. Navigating this requires a delicate balance, ensuring that client information is protected while also fulfilling legal duties. The pressure to maintain client relationships can sometimes create an environment where employees might be tempted to overlook or delay regulatory requirements, making careful judgment and adherence to established protocols paramount. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves prioritizing the immediate reporting of the suspicious transaction to the relevant regulatory authority, as mandated by anti-money laundering (AML) regulations. This aligns with the report first, ask questions later principle often embedded in financial crime compliance frameworks. PACS Group, as a regulated entity, has a legal and ethical obligation to proactively identify and report suspicious activities to prevent financial crime. This immediate reporting demonstrates a commitment to regulatory compliance and the integrity of the financial system, overriding the desire to first gather more information from the client, which could alert them and facilitate further illicit activity. Incorrect approaches analysis. Delaying the report to first contact the client for clarification is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This approach risks tipping off the client about the suspicion, which is a criminal offense under AML legislation, and directly undermines the purpose of suspicious activity reporting. Prioritizes the client relationship over legal obligations and the broader fight against financial crime. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the transaction as a potential misunderstanding without any further internal review or reporting. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to recognize red flags, potentially allowing illicit funds to pass through the firm. It violates the duty to be vigilant and report suspicious activity, exposing PACS Group to regulatory penalties and reputational damage. Finally, attempting to resolve the issue internally without involving the compliance department or reporting to the regulator is also a critical failure. This bypasses established internal controls and reporting channels designed to ensure regulatory adherence. It can lead to inconsistent application of policies, inadequate investigation, and a failure to meet the firm's legal obligations. Professional reasoning. Professionals in regulated environments like PACS Group must adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes regulatory compliance and ethical conduct. When faced with a potential suspicious transaction, the process should involve 1. Immediate identification of potential red flags. 2. Internal escalation to the compliance department for assessment. 3. Adherence to the firm's established suspicious activity reporting procedures, which typically involve prompt reporting to the relevant authority. 4. Understanding that client relationships, while important, do not supersede legal and regulatory obligations, especially when financial crime is suspected. Question 3. During the evaluation of a client's trading patterns at PACS Group, an employee notices a series of unusual trades that appear to be coordinated and potentially manipulative. The employee is aware of the client's sensitive position and the confidential nature of their financial dealings. What is the most appropriate and compliant course of action for the PACS Group employee? Option A. Inform the client directly about the observed suspicious trading patterns and ask for an explanation. Option B. Immediately report the suspicious trading activity to the relevant regulatory authority without informing anyone else at PACS Group. Option C. Continue monitoring the client's trades but take no immediate action, assuming the activity is legitimate until proven otherwise. Option D. Discreetly escalate the concern to the PACS Group Compliance Department for further investigation and guidance. Correct answer is B. Immediately report the suspicious trading activity to the relevant regulatory authority without informing anyone else at PACS Group. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a PACS Group employee due to the inherent conflict between client confidentiality and the need to report potential market abuse. The employee must navigate the delicate balance of protecting sensitive client information while fulfilling their regulatory obligations to maintain market integrity. Failure to act appropriately could result in significant reputational damage to PACS Group, regulatory sanctions, and personal disciplinary action. Careful judgment is required to determine the appropriate course of action without breaching client trust or violating regulatory mandates. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves discreetly escalating the concern through internal channels to the compliance department. This is the most appropriate professional response because it adheres to PACS Group's internal policies and regulatory requirements for reporting suspicious activity. The compliance department is equipped to investigate such matters thoroughly and confidentially, ensuring that any necessary reporting to the relevant regulatory body, e.g., the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK, is handled correctly and in accordance with the law. This method protects client confidentiality by not directly disclosing information to external parties prematurely and ensures that the investigation is conducted by trained professionals. Incorrect approaches analysis. Disclosing the information directly to the client without consulting compliance is an incorrect approach. This could alert the client to an investigation, potentially allowing them to destroy evidence or further engage in market abuse. It also bypasses the established internal reporting procedures designed to ensure regulatory compliance and protect the firm. Ignoring the suspicious activity is a severe regulatory and ethical failure. PACS Group, like all regulated financial firms, has a duty to report suspected market abuse. Failure to do so can lead to significant fines and sanctions for both the firm and the individual employee. It undermines market integrity and demonstrates a lack of professional responsibility. Contacting the regulatory body directly without internal consultation is also an incorrect approach. While reporting to regulators is a requirement, bypassing internal compliance procedures can create confusion, lead to incomplete information being provided, and potentially breach client confidentiality unnecessarily. Internal compliance departments are the designated point of contact for such matters, ensuring a coordinated and compliant response. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such situations should first identify the potential regulatory breach and the conflict with client confidentiality. The next step is to consult internal policies and procedures for reporting suspicious activity. If internal policies are unclear, seeking guidance from the compliance department is paramount. The decision-making process should prioritize adherence to regulatory obligations while employing the most discreet and professional methods to investigate and report. This involves a structured approach of identification, consultation, and compliant action. Question 4. Strategic planning requires PACS Group to consider how to respond when a long-standing client, who has historically invested conservatively, requests a significant shift into a highly speculative, illiquid asset class that falls outside their established risk profile, and for which they express a limited understanding of the underlying mechanics. Option A. Decline the client's request outright, citing the speculative nature of the asset class and the client's lack of experience, without further discussion or exploration of alternatives. Option B. Inform the client that while the investment is highly speculative, PACS Group can facilitate the transaction if the client signs a waiver acknowledging the risks, thereby absolving PACS Group of further responsibility. Option C. Engage in a detailed discussion with the client to understand the drivers behind this sudden change in investment strategy. Explain the specific risks and regulatory considerations associated with the requested asset class, and explore whether alternative, more suitable investments could meet their underlying objectives. Option D. Proceed with the client's requested investment immediately, as the client's instruction is paramount, and PACS Group should not override their wishes. Correct answer is D. Proceed with the client's requested investment immediately, as the client's instruction is paramount, and PACS Group should not override their wishes. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated preference and the firm's regulatory obligations and ethical duties. PACS Group, as a regulated entity, must prioritize compliance with the FCA's Conduct of Business Sourcebook, COBS, and its own internal policies over a client's potentially misinformed or unsuitable request. The challenge lies in navigating this conflict while maintaining client trust and providing sound financial advice. The correct approach involves a thorough assessment of the client's understanding and the suitability of their request in light of regulatory requirements. This means not simply executing the client's instruction, but but engaging in a dialogue to understand their rationale, explain the risks and regulatory implications, and offer alternative solutions that align with their objectives and are compliant. This approach is justified by COBS 9, which mandates that firms must take reasonable steps to ensure that any advice or transaction is suitable for the client, considering their knowledge and experience, financial situation, and investment objectives. Furthermore, the firm's duty of care and the principles of treating customers fairly, TCF, require proactive engagement to protect the client from potentially detrimental decisions. An incorrect approach would be to immediately execute the client's instruction without further due diligence. This fails to meet the suitability requirements of COBS 9 and potentially exposes both the client and PACS group to significant risk. It also breaches the principle of treating customers fairly by not adequately informing the client of the implications of their request. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss the client's request outright without attempting to understand their underlying needs or offering alternative, suitable options. This demonstrates a lack of client care and could damage the professional relationship, potentially leading to complaints and regulatory scrutiny for failing to act in the client's best interests. A third incorrect approach might involve providing a superficial explanation of the risks without actively seeking to understand the client's perspective or offering tailored alternatives, which still falls short of the proactive engagement required by regulatory principles. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the client's request, followed by a comprehensive assessment of its suitability and regulatory compliance. This involves active listening, clear communication of risks and benefits, exploration of alternatives, and documentation of the entire process. The ultimate goal is to ensure that any action taken is in the client's best interest and adheres strictly to regulatory mandates. Question 5. Performance analysis shows that a senior executive at PACS Group has requested immediate access to detailed client portfolio performance data for a specific client, citing an urgent need for a strategic review. The executive is a key stakeholder, but is not the direct client relationship manager for this particular client. What is the most appropriate immediate course of action for the PACS Group employee receiving this request? Option A. Immediately access the client portfolio performance data and provide it to the senior executive, as their seniority implies an implicit authorization for such requests. Option B. Acknowledge the request and immediately inform the senior executive that client data access requires specific authorization and that the request will be processed through the established internal channels, which will involve verifying the executive's need and obtaining necessary approvals before any data is shared. Option C. Attempt to find the information through informal channels or by accessing a general performance dashboard that might contain aggregated data, hoping it satisfies the executive's need without formal process. Option D. Inform the senior executive that you cannot provide the information due to strict client confidentiality rules without further explanation. Correct answer is B. Acknowledge the request and immediately inform the senior executive that client data access requires specific authorization and that the request will be processed through the established internal channels, which will involve verifying the executive's need and obtaining necessary approvals before any data is shared. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual at PACS Group to balance the immediate need for information with the strict regulatory requirements governing client data and confidentiality. The pressure to provide a swift response to a senior stakeholder, coupled with the potential for reputational damage if information is mishandled, necessitates careful judgment and adherence to established protocols. Misinterpreting or circumventing these protocols can lead to serious regulatory breaches and loss of client trust. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves acknowledging the request, immediately identifying the need for authorization, and clearly communicating the process to the senior stakeholder. This upholds PACS Group's commitment to regulatory compliance by ensuring that client data is accessed and shared only through approved channels and with appropriate consent. Specifically, it aligns with the principles of data protection and client confidentiality mandated by relevant financial regulations, which require strict controls over the dissemination of sensitive information. This approach demonstrates professional integrity and a commitment to ethical conduct. Incorrect approaches analysis. An incorrect approach would be to immediately provide the requested information without verifying authorization. This directly violates data protection regulations and internal PACS group policies, as it bypasses necessary checks and balances designed to safeguard client privacy. Such an action could expose PACS group to significant regulatory penalties and reputational damage. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the request or delay a response indefinitely. While this avoids immediate regulatory breach, it fails to meet professional standards of responsiveness and can undermine internal relationships and operational efficiency. It also misses an opportunity to educate the senior stakeholder on the importance of regulatory compliance. A third incorrect approach would be to attempt to access the information through unauthorized means or to provide a partial, unverified response. This is a severe breach of trust and regulatory requirements, demonstrating a disregard for established procedures and potentially leading to the dissemination of inaccurate or confidential information, with severe consequences for PACS Group and its clients. Professional reasoning. Professionals at PACS Group should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes regulatory compliance and ethical conduct. When faced with requests for client information, the first step is always to identify the nature of the request and the sensitivity of the data involved. Subsequently, one must ascertain the appropriate internal protocols and regulatory requirements for accessing and sharing such information. This typically involves seeking authorization from the relevant compliance or legal department, or from the client themselves, depending on the data and the requester. Clear and transparent communication with the requester, explaining the process and any necessary delays, is crucial for managing expectations and reinforcing the importance of adherence to these procedures. Question 6. Compliance review shows that a long-standing client of PACS Group, Mr. Davies, has requested to invest a significant portion of his savings into a highly speculative, high-risk investment product. Mr. Davies has explicitly stated he understands the risks and wishes to proceed immediately, overriding any standard suitability checks. He has been a client for many years and has always followed PACS Group's advice. What is the most appropriate course of action for the PACS Group advisor in this situation, adhering strictly to the FCA handbook? Option A. Conduct a full suitability assessment, explaining to Mr. Davies that while his instruction is noted, the firm is obligated by FCA regulations to ensure the investment is appropriate for his circumstances, and if it is not, the firm cannot proceed. Option B. Suggest a slightly less risky, but still high-risk, alternative product that might satisfy Mr. Davies' desire for aggressive growth, even if it also falls outside his stated risk tolerance. Option C. Proceed with the investment as requested by Mr. Davies, noting his explicit instruction and long-standing relationship to maintain client satisfaction. Option D. Inform Mr. Davies that the firm cannot fulfill his request due to the high-risk nature of the product, without further explanation, to avoid potential future disputes. Correct answer is C. Proceed with the investment as requested by Mr. Davies, noting his explicit instruction and long-standing relationship to maintain client satisfaction. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated preference and the firm's regulatory obligations. PACS Group, as a regulated entity, must prioritize compliance with the Financial Conduct Authority (FCA) handbook, specifically the Conduct of Business (COBS) sourcebook, over a client's potentially misinformed or unsuitable request. The challenge lies in navigating this conflict while maintaining client relationships and upholding professional integrity. Careful judgment is required to identify the regulatory imperative and act accordingly, even if it means disagreeing with the client. The correct approach involves identifying the client's request as potentially unsuitable based on their stated financial situation and objectives, and then proceeding with the firm's established suitability assessment process. This process, mandated by FCA regulations, e.g., COBS 9, requires PACS Group to gather sufficient information about the client's knowledge, experience, financial situation, and investment objectives to recommend suitable products and services. If the requested product is deemed unsuitable, the firm has a regulatory duty to explain why and not proceed with the transaction. This upholds the principle of treating customers fairly, TCF, and ensures that client interests are paramount. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the client's request without conducting a thorough suitability assessment. This directly violates COBS 9 requirements and exposes PACS Group to regulatory sanctions, reputational damage, and potential client detriment. Another incorrect approach would be to simply refuse the client's request without providing a clear, reasoned explanation based on suitability. While the firm may not proceed, a lack of transparency in client education is contrary to the TCF principle and can damage the client relationship. Finally, attempting to find a loophole or a slightly different product that technically meets the request but still carries significant unsuitability risks would also be an ethical and regulatory failure, as it undermines the spirit of the regulations. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the client's request. Next, they must cross-reference this request against the firm's internal policies and, crucially, the relevant regulatory requirements, in this case, the FCA handbook. If a conflict arises, the regulatory obligation takes precedence. The professional must then communicate clearly and transparently with the client, explaining the rationale for any decision, particularly if it deviates from the client's initial preference, citing regulatory requirements and the principle of suitability. Question 7. The performance metrics show that a particular investment product, which PACS Group is currently promoting, has generated significant returns over the past year. A client who has expressed interest in increasing their investment portfolio's growth potential has been presented with this product by a PACS Group advisor. The advisor is eager to close the sale, citing the strong performance data. However, the advisor has not yet conducted a detailed review of the client's current financial situation, risk tolerance, or long-term investment goals beyond the client's general desire for growth. What is the most appropriate course of action for the PACS Group advisor in this situation? Option A. Conduct a comprehensive suitability assessment of the client, thoroughly reviewing their financial situation, risk tolerance, and investment objectives to determine if the product is genuinely appropriate before making any recommendation. Option B. Recommend the product based on the client's stated interest in growth potential, assuming that past performance is a reliable indicator of future results and that the client understands the inherent risks. Option C. Advise the client to invest solely based on the sales team's positive feedback and the general market trend for this product, without further individual client assessment. Option D. Proceed with the recommendation of the investment product, emphasizing the strong past performance metrics to the client, and secure the sale. Correct answer is D. Proceed with the recommendation of the investment product, emphasizing the strong past performance metrics to the client, and secure the sale. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between achieving business objectives and adhering to regulatory requirements, particularly concerning client suitability and fair treatment. PACS Group's obligation is to act in the best interests of its clients, which necessitates a thorough understanding of their financial situation, investment objectives, and risk tolerance before recommending any product. The performance metrics, while indicating potential profitability, do not inherently confirm suitability. A failure to adequately assess suitability could lead to client detriment, regulatory sanctions, and reputational damage for PACS Group. The correct approach involves a comprehensive review of the client's profile against the specific product's characteristics. This means going beyond superficial performance data to understand the underlying reasons for that performance and whether it aligns with the client's stated needs and capacity for risk. Regulatory frameworks, such as those governing financial advice and product distribution, mandate that recommendations must be suitable for the individual client. This involves a documented assessment process that considers all relevant client information and the nature of the product. Ethical principles also dictate a duty of care, requiring professionals to act with diligence and integrity, prioritizing client well-being over immediate sales targets. An incorrect approach would be to solely rely on the positive performance metrics as justification for recommending the product. This overlooks the fundamental regulatory requirement for suitability assessment and the ethical obligation to understand the client's individual circumstances. Another incorrect approach would be to proceed with the recommendation without any further client consultation, assuming that past performance guarantees future suitability or that the client implicitly understands the risks. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a disregard for the client's best interests. Finally, a flawed approach would be to push the product based on the sales team's enthusiasm or the perceived market trend, without independently verifying if the product is appropriate for the specific client in question. This prioritizes commercial pressures over regulatory compliance and ethical conduct. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making process that begins with understanding the client's needs and objectives. This is followed by a thorough evaluation of the product's features, risks, and benefits, and a clear assessment of how these align with the client's profile. Documentation of this assessment is crucial for demonstrating compliance and providing a defensible record of the recommendation process. When faced with performance data, professionals must critically analyze it in the context of suitability, rather than accepting it at face value. Question 8. Benchmark analysis indicates that a PACS Group client has requested a specialized financial analysis that requires the use of a third-party vendor with advanced data processing capabilities. The employee believes that to perform this analysis effectively, they will need to share certain non-public client financial details with the vendor. The vendor has provided a standard confidentiality agreement. What is the most appropriate course of action for the PACS Group employee to ensure compliance with regulatory obligations and ethical standards? Option A. Share only anonymized versions of the client's financial data with the vendor, as this removes direct identifiers. Option B. Share the non-public client financial details with the vendor, relying on the vendor's confidentiality agreement to protect the information. Option C. Obtain explicit, documented consent from the client to share the specific non-public financial details with the vendor for the stated purpose. Option D. Consult with the internal PACS Group compliance department and proceed based on their advice without directly informing the client about the data sharing. The correct answer is C. Obtain explicit, documented consent from the client to share the specific non-public financial details with the vendor for the stated purpose. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a PACS Group employee regarding the handling of potentially sensitive client information. The challenge lies in balancing the need for internal collaboration to provide effective service with the strict regulatory obligations to protect client confidentiality. Misjudging the appropriate level of information sharing could lead to regulatory breaches, reputational damage, and loss of client trust. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves seeking explicit, documented consent from the client before sharing any non-public information with the external vendor. This aligns with the fundamental principles of client data protection and privacy, which are paramount under relevant financial services regulations. Obtaining consent ensures that the client is fully informed about how their data will be used and by whom, thereby upholding their right to control their personal information. This proactive step mitigates the risk of unauthorized disclosure and demonstrates a commitment to ethical data handling practices. Incorrect approaches analysis. Sharing the information without client consent, even with the assurance of the vendor's confidentiality agreement, is a direct violation of data protection regulations. This approach disregards the client's proprietary rights over their information and assumes a level of authorization that has not been granted. It exposes PACS Group to significant regulatory penalties and legal liabilities. Sharing only anonymized data without explicit consent is also problematic. While anonymization can reduce direct identification, the effectiveness and irreversibility of anonymization can be debated, and regulations often require consent for any use of client data, even if anonymized, if it could potentially be re-identified, or if the anonymization process itself involves data processing that requires authorization. Furthermore, the definition of anonymized can be subjective and may not meet regulatory standards for de-identification. Consulting only with the internal compliance department without engaging the client is insufficient. While internal consultation is a good step, it does not absolve the employee of the responsibility to obtain client consent. Compliance departments advise on regulatory requirements, but the ultimate authority for data sharing rests with the client, who must provide informed consent. Professional reasoning. Professionals in the financial services industry must adopt a client-centric approach that prioritizes regulatory compliance and ethical conduct. When faced with a situation involving client data, the decision-making process should begin with identifying the specific regulatory requirements governing data privacy and confidentiality. This should be followed by an assessment of the nature of the data and the proposed use. Crucially, the process must include obtaining informed consent from the client for any disclosure of non-public information. If there is any doubt about the permissibility of data sharing, seeking guidance from the compliance department is essential, but this should complement, not replace, client consent. Question 9. The risk matrix shows a moderate likelihood of a data breach related to client information being accessed by unauthorized personnel. A senior colleague in another department at PACS Group urgently requests access to specific client financial details, stating it is for a critical client review. You are unsure if this colleague has the necessary authorization or if the request aligns with PACS Group's data privacy policies. What is the most appropriate course of action for you to take? Option A. Immediately access the client's financial details and forward them to the senior colleague via a secure internal messaging system after confirming the colleague's identity. Option B. Forward the senior colleague's request to a junior member of your team who is familiar with client data to handle the verification and retrieval process. Option C. Consult PACS Group's internal data protection policies and relevant regulatory guidelines to verify the senior colleague's authorization and the appropriate procedure for sharing such information, and then proceed accordingly. Option D. Politely inform the senior colleague that you cannot provide any client information without explicit written authorization from the client themselves, and suggest they obtain it. The correct answer is A. Immediately access the client's financial details and forward them to the senior colleague via a secure internal messaging system after confirming the colleague's identity. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an individual to balance the immediate need for information with the strict regulatory requirements governing client data confidentiality and the proper handling of sensitive information within PACS Group. The pressure to provide a quick response to a senior colleague must not override the fundamental duty to protect client privacy and adhere to internal policies and external regulations. Careful judgment is required to identify the appropriate channels and methods for information retrieval and dissemination, ensuring compliance at all times. The correct approach involves recognizing that, while the information is needed urgently, it must be accessed and shared through authorized and compliant channels. This means consulting the PACS Group's internal data protection policies and relevant regulatory guidelines to determine the appropriate procedure for accessing and sharing client information, even with a senior colleague. This approach upholds the principles of data privacy, client confidentiality, and regulatory compliance, which are paramount in the financial services industry. It demonstrates an understanding of professional responsibility and the importance of maintaining trust with clients and regulatory bodies. An incorrect approach of directly accessing the client's personal financial details without verifying the senior colleague's authorization or the legitimate business need, and then sharing it via an unsecured method like a personal email, represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This action breaches client confidentiality, violates data protection laws, such as GDPR if applicable to the exam's jurisdiction, or equivalent local regulations, and contravenes PACS Group's internal policies on data handling and information security. It exposes the firm to reputational damage, regulatory penalties, and potential legal action. Another incorrect approach of refusing to provide any information whatsoever, even after the senior colleague clarifies the legitimate business purpose and potential authorization, is also professionally unsound. Caution is necessary. An outright refusal without exploring compliant avenues can hinder legitimate business operations and demonstrate a lack of teamwork and understanding of business needs. This approach fails to consider the nuances of information sharing within a regulated environment, where authorized access for legitimate business purposes is permitted under strict controls. A third incorrect approach of forwarding the request to a junior colleague to handle, without providing clear guidance or ensuring they understand the regulatory implications, is also problematic. This deflects responsibility and could lead to the junior colleague making a similar error, or it could delay the process unnecessarily. It fails to demonstrate leadership in navigating complex regulatory requirements and ensuring that the information is handled appropriately by the most qualified individual. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the regulatory framework and internal policies. When faced with a request for sensitive information, professionals should 1. Ascertain the legitimacy and authorization of the request. 2. Identify the specific information required and its sensitivity. 3. Consult relevant internal policies and external regulations regarding data access and sharing. 4. Determine the authorized and compliant method for retrieving and disseminating the information. 5. If unsure, seek guidance from compliance, legal, or a designated data protection officer. 6. Ensure all actions taken are documented and auditable. Question 10. Quality control measures reveal that a senior analyst at PACS Group, who is responsible for advising on a significant corporate restructuring for a key client, has recently entered into a personal relationship with a senior executive at that client company. The analyst has not disclosed this relationship to PACS Group management or its compliance department. What is the most appropriate course of action for PACS Group to take in this situation? Option A. Allow the analyst to continue with the client engagement, assuming the personal relationship will not influence their professional judgment, and monitor the situation discreetly. Option B. Promptly reassign the client engagement to another team within PACS Group without informing the analyst of the specific reason to avoid potential awkwardness. Option C. Immediately initiate a formal review of the analyst's client engagement, conduct a thorough assessment of the potential conflict of interest, and implement appropriate safeguards, or reassign the analyst to ensure client interests and regulatory compliance are paramount. Option D. Advise the analyst to discreetly manage the personal relationship and ensure it does not impact their work, without formal disclosure to PACS Group, to avoid unnecessary complications. The correct answer is C. Immediately initiate a formal review of the analyst's client engagement, conduct a thorough assessment of the potential conflict of interest, and implement appropriate safeguards, or reassign the analyst to ensure client interests and regulatory compliance are paramount. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the potential for a conflict of interest and the need to maintain client confidentiality and regulatory compliance. PACS Group's reputation and client trust are at stake. The core issue is how to handle sensitive client information when a personal relationship might create an appearance of impropriety or actual bias. Careful judgment is required to ensure that all actions are transparent, ethical, and adhere strictly to the PACS Group's internal policies and relevant regulatory frameworks. The correct approach involves immediate and transparent disclosure of the personal relationship to the relevant compliance officer or supervisor. This allows PACS Group to assess the situation objectively, implement appropriate safeguards, and ensure that the client's interests are protected and that no regulatory breaches occur. This proactive disclosure upholds the principles of integrity, transparency, and client duty, which are fundamental to financial services regulation and ethical conduct. It demonstrates a commitment to avoiding conflicts of interest and maintaining client confidence, aligning with the spirit and letter of regulatory requirements designed to protect market integrity and investor welfare. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the client engagement without disclosing the personal relationship. This failure to disclose creates a significant conflict of interest, potentially leading to biased advice or preferential treatment, which is a direct violation of ethical standards and regulatory obligations concerning client duty and market integrity. Another incorrect approach would be to attempt to manage the conflict internally without involving compliance or senior management. This bypasses established governance procedures and risks inadequate mitigation of the conflict, potentially exposing PACS Group to regulatory sanctions and reputational damage. Finally, terminating the relationship abruptly without proper consultation or consideration of the client's best interests, especially if the relationship was not inherently problematic, could also be professionally unsound and potentially breach contractual or ethical obligations. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes transparency, adherence to policy, and seeking guidance. When a potential conflict of interest arises, the first step is to identify it clearly. The next step is to consult the firm's internal policies and procedures regarding conflicts of interest. If the situation warrants, immediate disclosure to the designated compliance officer or supervisor is crucial. This allows for an informed decision on how to proceed, which might include recusal, enhanced supervision, or other mitigation strategies. The overarching principle is to act in the best interest of the client and the firm, maintaining the highest standards of integrity and regulatory compliance. Question 11. Investigation of a client's trading pattern by a PACS Group analyst reveals a series of transactions that, while not definitively illegal, appear to be based on non-public information. The analyst is concerned about potential market abuse, but also recognizes the importance of client confidentiality. What is the most appropriate course of action for the PACS Group analyst? Option A. Discreetly report the observed trading pattern and the analyst's concerns to the PACS Group Compliance Department for further investigation. Option B. Immediately report the trading pattern and concerns directly to the relevant regulatory authority without informing PACS Group's compliance department. Option C. Ignore the trading pattern as it is not definitively illegal and avoid any action that might jeopardize the client relationship. Option D. Directly question the client about the rationale behind their recent trading activities. The correct answer is A. Discreetly report the observed trading pattern and the analyst's concerns to the PACS Group Compliance Department for further investigation. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a PACS Group employee due to the inherent conflict between client confidentiality and the need to report potential market abuse. The employee must navigate the delicate balance of protecting client information while upholding regulatory obligations to maintain market integrity. Careful judgment is required to avoid both breaching client trust and failing to report suspicious activity. The correct approach involves discreetly escalating the concern through internal channels, such as the compliance department, without directly confronting the client or making assumptions. This upholds professional integrity by adhering to regulatory requirements for reporting suspicious activities while respecting client confidentiality protocols. The PACS Group's internal policies and relevant regulatory guidelines, such as those pertaining to market abuse and insider dealing, mandate reporting such suspicions to the appropriate internal authority for investigation. This ensures that regulatory bodies are alerted if necessary, without prematurely or improperly disclosing information to the client. An incorrect approach would be to directly question the client about their trading activities. This breaches client confidentiality, potentially damaging the client relationship and violating data protection principles. It also risks tipping off the client, allowing them to alter their behavior and obstruct any potential investigation. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the suspicious activity. This is a failure to comply with regulatory obligations to report potential market abuse, which can lead to severe penalties for both the individual and PACS Group. It undermines market integrity and demonstrates a lack of professional responsibility. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to report the suspicion directly to a regulatory authority without first consulting PACS Group's compliance department. While reporting to regulators is a duty, bypassing internal procedures can lead to uncoordinated investigations, potential breaches of internal policies, and an inefficient use of resources. The internal compliance function is designed to assess and manage such situations effectively. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes adherence to regulatory frameworks and ethical codes. This involves 1. Identifying the potential issue and its regulatory implications. 2. Consulting internal policies and procedures for guidance. 3. Escalating concerns through designated internal channels, e.g., compliance. 4. Acting with discretion and maintaining confidentiality throughout the process. 5. Documenting all actions taken. Question 12. Strategic planning requires PACS Group to consider expanding its services into a new international market. The business development team is eager to capitalize on perceived market opportunities and has presented a preliminary plan for rapid entry. However, there are concerns that the regulatory framework in this new market may differ significantly from PACS Group's current operating environment, potentially impacting service delivery and client protection. What is the most prudent approach for PACS Group to ensure compliance and ethical operations during this strategic expansion? Option A. Conduct a comprehensive regulatory and legal due diligence process in the target market, involving legal and compliance teams, to identify all applicable laws, regulations, and industry standards, and ensure PACS Group's proposed operations are fully compliant before market entry. Option B. Proceed with market entry based on the assumption that PACS Group's existing compliance policies and procedures are universally applicable and sufficient for any new jurisdiction. Option C. Delegate the responsibility for assessing regulatory requirements to the business development team, trusting their market knowledge to identify and address any compliance needs. Option D. Prioritize rapid market entry to gain a competitive advantage, with the intention of addressing any identified regulatory issues or compliance gaps after operations have commenced. The correct answer is A. Conduct a comprehensive regulatory and legal due diligence process in the target market, involving legal and compliance teams, to identify all applicable laws, regulations, and industry standards, and ensure PACS Group's proposed operations are fully compliant before market entry. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the company's strategic growth objectives with the stringent regulatory obligations of PACS Group. The pressure to expand into new markets, particularly those with potentially less developed regulatory oversight, necessitates a robust understanding of compliance frameworks to avoid significant legal, financial, and reputational damage. Careful judgment is required to ensure that aggressive business development does not lead to a compromise of ethical standards or regulatory adherence. The correct approach involves proactively engaging with legal and compliance teams to conduct thorough due diligence on the target market's regulatory landscape. This ensures that PACS Group's business model and operational procedures are aligned with local laws and industry best practices before any commitment is made. This approach is correct because it prioritizes regulatory compliance as a foundational element of strategic planning, thereby mitigating risks. Specifically, under the PACS Group hiring assessment tests implied regulatory framework, which we assume aligns with robust financial services regulations, requiring adherence to local laws and international standards where applicable. This proactive stance demonstrates a commitment to lawful operations and responsible expansion. It aligns with the ethical duty of care owed to clients and the market, and the regulatory imperative to operate within legal boundaries. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with market entry based on the assumption that existing compliance measures are sufficient. This fails to acknowledge that regulatory environments vary significantly and can have specific nuances that PACS Group's current framework may not cover. This approach risks violating local regulations, leading to fines, sanctions, and reputational damage. Another incorrect approach would be to delegate the entire compliance assessment to the business development team without adequate legal or compliance oversight. While the business development team may have market insights, they may lack the specialized knowledge to identify all potential regulatory pitfalls. This delegation of responsibility without proper expertise can lead to oversight of critical compliance requirements, exposing PACS Group to regulatory breaches. A further incorrect approach would be to prioritize speed to market over thorough regulatory review, believing that compliance issues can be addressed retroactively. This is a dangerous strategy that disregards the principle of compliance by design and the potential for significant harm caused by non-compliance during the interim period. Regulatory bodies typically expect adherence from the outset, and retroactive fixes are often insufficient to mitigate past violations. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured risk assessment framework. This framework should mandate the involvement of legal and compliance departments at the earliest stages of strategic initiatives. Key steps include identifying relevant jurisdiction, researching applicable laws and regulations, assessing the impact of these on PACS Group's operations, developing mitigation strategies, and obtaining formal sign-off from compliance and legal before proceeding. This ensures that strategic decisions are informed by a comprehensive understanding of the regulatory environment and ethical considerations. Question 13. Governance review demonstrates that a critical client onboarding process at PACS Group is experiencing delays due to missing financial documentation. You require this documentation to complete your analysis and advise the client effectively. The documentation is stored on a shared network drive, but your access permissions do not currently include this specific folder. Which of the following actions should you take to resolve this issue? Option A. Access the client's financial documentation directly from the shared drive, as the information is necessary for your immediate task. Option B. Ask a colleague who you believe has access to the folder to share the documentation with you via email. Option C. Proceed with your analysis using the information you currently have available, assuming the missing documentation is not critical. Option D. Formally request access to the required client financial documentation through the established internal procedure, seeking approval from the compliance department. The correct answer is D. Formally request access to the required client financial documentation through the established internal procedure, seeking approval from the compliance department. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual at PACS Group to balance the immediate need for information with the strict regulatory requirements governing client data privacy and confidentiality. The challenge lies in identifying the appropriate channels and permissions for accessing sensitive information, ensuring that no breaches of regulatory frameworks occur. Careful judgment is required to avoid unauthorized access, which could lead to significant legal and reputational damage for PACS Group. The correct approach involves adhering strictly to PACS Group's internal policies and relevant regulatory guidelines for data access. This means formally requesting the information through the designated channels, which would likely involve seeking approval from the compliance department or the relevant data protection officer. This approach is correct because it prioritizes regulatory compliance and data security. Specifically, it aligns with principles of data minimization and purpose limitation, ensuring that access is granted only when necessary and for legitimate business purposes, as mandated by regulations like GDPR, if applicable to the exam's jurisdiction, or similar data protection laws. It also upholds the ethical duty of confidentiality owed to clients. An incorrect approach would be to attempt to access the client's confidential information directly from the shared drive without proper authorization. This is a regulatory and ethical failure because it bypasses established security protocols and likely violates data protection laws that prohibit unauthorized access to personal or sensitive client data. Such an action could be construed as a data breach, leading to severe penalties for PACS Group and disciplinary action for the individual. Another incorrect approach would be to ask a colleague who might have access to the information for it directly, without following the formal request procedure. While seemingly less severe than direct unauthorized access, this still represents a failure to adhere to internal policies and regulatory requirements for data handling, creates a risk of information being disseminated inappropriately, and does not provide an audit trail for data access, which is crucial for compliance. A third incorrect approach would be to assume the information is readily available and proceed with the analysis without verifying access permissions. This demonstrates a lack of diligence and a disregard for the importance of data governance. It risks making decisions based on incomplete or improperly obtained information, further compounding the regulatory and ethical issues. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the relevant regulatory framework and internal company policies. When faced with a need for sensitive information, the first step should always be to identify the authorized method of access. If unsure, consulting with the compliance department or legal counsel is paramount. Prioritizing compliance and ethical conduct over expediency is essential for maintaining trust and avoiding legal repercussions. Question 14. When evaluating a new client's request at PACS Group to invest a significant portion of their portfolio in a highly speculative, illiquid asset class that they have identified, what is the most appropriate course of action for the financial advisor? Option A. Proceed with the investment as requested by the client, documenting their explicit instruction. Option B. Execute the investment immediately to satisfy the client's immediate desire, and then conduct a suitability review afterward. Option C. Inform the client that the requested investment is not permitted by PACS Group's internal policies and decline to proceed. Option D. Conduct a thorough suitability assessment of the client's financial situation, investment objectives, and risk tolerance, and then provide advice based on this assessment, explaining any discrepancies with the client's initial request. The correct answer is A. Proceed with the investment as requested by the client, documenting their explicit instruction. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated preference and the firm's regulatory obligations and ethical duties. PACS Group, as a financial services firm, is bound by strict regulations to act in the best interests of its clients and to ensure that all advice and recommendations are suitable. The challenge lies in navigating the client's desire for a specific, potentially unsuitable, investment with the firm's duty to provide objective, compliant advice. Careful judgment is required to balance client satisfaction with regulatory adherence and ethical responsibility. The correct approach involves a thorough assessment of the client's financial situation, investment objectives, and risk tolerance, followed by providing advice that aligns with these factors and regulatory requirements, even if it contradicts the client's initial request. This approach prioritizes the client's best interests and ensures compliance with the regulatory framework governing financial advice. Specifically, it adheres to the principle of suitability, which mandates that recommendations must be appropriate for the client's circumstances. This involves a detailed fact-finding process and a clear explanation to the client of why certain investments may or may not be suitable, supported by evidence and rationale. An incorrect approach that involves immediately executing the client's request without proper due diligence fails to uphold the firm's fiduciary duty and regulatory obligations. This could lead to significant client harm if the investment is unsuitable, resulting in financial losses and potential regulatory sanctions for PACS Group. Another incorrect approach, which involves dismissing the client's request outright without a proper explanation or alternative suggestions, demonstrates poor client relationship management and a failure to engage in a constructive advisory process. While it might avoid immediate regulatory breach, it risks alienating the client and failing to meet the spirit of providing comprehensive financial advice. A third incorrect approach, which involves providing a superficial rationale for the client's request without a deep dive into suitability, is also problematic as it can be seen as a way to circumvent the regulatory process, potentially leading to mis-selling and regulatory scrutiny. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a comprehensive understanding of the client's needs and objectives. This should be followed by a rigorous assessment of potential investments against these criteria, always with regulatory compliance and the client's best interests at the forefront. If a client's request conflicts with these principles, the professional must clearly and respectfully explain the reasons for the divergence, offering suitable alternatives and documenting the entire process thoroughly. This ensures transparency, accountability, and adherence to professional standards. Question 15. Strategic planning requires PACS Group to evaluate a potential new client whose proposed transaction, while lucrative, carries a heightened risk profile. The client has provided assurances regarding the legitimacy of their activities, but a preliminary review suggests potential complexities that could impact client outcomes and market integrity if not managed appropriately. Which approach best aligns with PACS Group's commitment to regulatory compliance and ethical conduct? Option A. Prioritize securing the contract due to its significant profitability, assuming the client's assurances are sufficient and further investigation would jeopardize the deal. Option B. Seek immediate approval from senior management to proceed, highlighting the financial benefits and downplaying the identified complexities. Option C. Conduct a comprehensive impact assessment, documenting all potential risks and mitigation strategies in line with PACS Group's internal policies and relevant regulatory guidelines before proceeding. Option D. Proceed with the transaction based on the client's assurances, deferring any detailed impact assessment until after the contract is finalized. The correct answer is C. Conduct a comprehensive impact assessment, documenting all potential risks and mitigation strategies in line with PACS Group's internal policies and relevant regulatory guidelines before proceeding. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for PACS Group due to the inherent conflict between client profitability and regulatory compliance. The pressure to secure a new contract, while understandable from a business perspective, must be balanced against the stringent requirements of the PACS Group's regulatory framework, which prioritizes client protection and market integrity. Careful judgment is required to navigate this tension without compromising ethical standards or legal obligations. The correct approach involves a thorough and documented assessment of the potential impact of the proposed transaction on all relevant stakeholders, including the client, PACS Group, and the broader market, and ensuring that this assessment is conducted in strict adherence to the PACS Group's internal policies and the relevant regulatory guidelines. This approach is correct because it proactively identifies and mitigates risks, demonstrating a commitment to responsible business conduct and regulatory compliance. Specifically, it aligns with the principle of know your client and the obligation to conduct due diligence, ensuring that PACS Group does not facilitate or engage in activities that could be detrimental to clients or the financial system. This proactive risk management is a cornerstone of regulatory expectations for firms operating within the financial services sector. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the immediate financial gain of securing the contract fails to acknowledge the potential for significant regulatory breaches and reputational damage. This approach is ethically unsound, as it prioritizes profit over client welfare and regulatory adherence, could lead to violations of rules designed to prevent market abuse, money laundering, or other illicit activities, resulting in severe penalties for PACS Group, including fines, sanctions, and loss of operating licenses. Another incorrect approach that involves proceeding with the transaction without a comprehensive impact assessment, relying on the client's assurances, demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a disregard for established risk management protocols. This abdication of responsibility is a direct contravention of regulatory expectations that firms must actively identify and manage risks. It exposes PACS Group to significant legal and financial liabilities, as it would be unable to demonstrate that it took reasonable steps to prevent potential harm or misconduct. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured risk assessment framework. This framework should include 1. Identifying potential risks and their likelihood and impact. 2. Evaluating these risks against the firm's risk appetite and regulatory obligations. 3. Developing and implementing mitigation strategies. And 4. Documenting the entire process and decision-making rationale. In situations involving potential conflicts between commercial objectives and regulatory requirements, professionals must always err on the side of caution, prioritizing compliance and client protection. Escalation to senior management or the compliance department should be considered if there is any doubt about the appropriateness of a proposed course of action. Question 16. Analysis of a situation at PACS Group where a long-standing client, who has previously expressed a conservative investment approach, now requests to invest a significant portion of their portfolio into a highly speculative, emerging market cryptocurrency fund. The client states they have seen significant gains in this area and are eager to participate. What is the most appropriate course of action for the PACS Group advisor? Option A. Immediately execute the client's request to invest in the cryptocurrency fund, as the client is a long-standing client and has explicitly requested this investment. Option B. Decline the client's request to invest in the cryptocurrency fund, citing the firm's policy against speculative investments without further discussion. Option C. Conduct a thorough suitability assessment to understand the client's current financial situation, risk tolerance, and investment objectives, and then explain the risks and potential benefits of the requested investment in the context of their overall portfolio, offering alternative suitable investments if necessary. Option D. Advise the client to move their assets to another firm that specializes in cryptocurrency investments, as PACS Group does not offer such products. The correct answer is C. Conduct a thorough suitability assessment to understand the client's current financial situation, risk tolerance, and investment objectives, and then explain the risks and potential benefits of the requested investment in the context of their overall portfolio, offering alternative suitable investments if necessary. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's immediate desire for a specific investment product and the firm's regulatory obligation to ensure suitability. PACS Group, as a regulated entity, must prioritize client protection and adhere to stringent suitability rules. The challenge lies in balancing client autonomy with the fiduciary duty to act in the client's best interest, especially when a client's request might not align with their risk tolerance or financial objectives as understood by the firm. Careful judgment is required to navigate this delicate balance without compromising regulatory compliance or client trust. The correct approach involves a thorough suitability assessment that goes beyond simply fulfilling the client's stated request. This approach prioritizes understanding the client's overall financial situation, investment objectives, risk tolerance, and knowledge of investments. It requires the advisor to explain the rationale behind their recommendation, highlighting how it aligns with the client's profile, and addressing any potential discrepancies between the client's request and what is deemed suitable. This aligns with regulatory frameworks that mandate suitability assessments before recommending or executing transactions, ensuring that investments are appropriate for the client's circumstances. Ethically, it upholds the principle of acting in the client's best interest. An incorrect approach that directly executes the client's request without a proper suitability assessment fails to meet regulatory obligations. This could lead to the client investing in products that are too risky, too complex, or not aligned with their financial goals, potentially resulting in significant losses. Such an action would violate the duty of care and the principle of suitability, exposing PACS Group to regulatory sanctions, reputational damage, and potential legal liabilities. Another incorrect approach, which is to dismiss the client's request outright without a proper explanation or alternative suggestion, is also professionally unsound. While it might stem from a desire to avoid risk, it fails to engage the client constructively and could damage the client relationship. It doesn't demonstrate an effort to understand the client's underlying motivations for the request or to educate them on more suitable alternatives. This approach lacks the client centricity expected of a financial advisor. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. 1. Active listening and information gathering. Understand the client's request and the reasons behind it. 2. Suitability assessment. Conduct a comprehensive evaluation of the client's financial situation, objectives, risk tolerance, and investment knowledge. 3. Gap analysis. Identify any discrepancies between the client's request and the suitability assessment. 4. Professional recommendation and education. Based on the assessment, provide a clear recommendation, explaining its rationale and how it aligns with the client's profile. If the client's request differs from the recommendation, explain why, addressing potential risks and offering suitable alternatives. 5. Client agreement and documentation. Ensure the client understands and agrees with the proposed course of action, documenting all discussions and decisions. Question 17. The audit findings indicate potential deficiencies in PACS Group's client onboarding procedures, specifically regarding the verification of beneficial ownership for certain high-risk clients. Which of the following approaches best addresses these findings in accordance with regulatory expectations for preventing financial crime? Option A. Implement a new automated system for client onboarding that relies solely on self-certification from clients, without any manual oversight or additional verification steps for high-risk individuals. Option B. Immediately suspend all new client onboarding until a complete overhaul of the entire client relationship management system can be completed, regardless of the impact on business operations. Option C. Acknowledge the findings in the audit report, but defer any significant changes to the onboarding process until the next scheduled review of the firm's AML policies, citing current operational pressures. Option D. Conduct a targeted review of the specific client files flagged in the audit. Implement enhanced due diligence measures for those clients, and update the client onboarding checklist to include additional verification steps for high-risk profiles. The correct answer is D. Conduct a targeted review of the specific client files flagged in the audit, implement enhanced due diligence measures for those clients, and update the client onboarding checklist to include additional verification steps for high-risk profiles. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a firm to balance the need for efficient client service with its fundamental regulatory obligations to prevent financial crime. The audit findings highlight potential weaknesses in PACS Group's anti-money laundering (AML) and counter-terrorist financing (CTF) controls, specifically concerning the onboarding of new clients. The firm must act decisively to address these findings without unduly disrupting legitimate business operations or alienating clients. Careful judgment is required to ensure that any remedial actions are proportionate, effective, and fully compliant with the relevant regulatory framework. The correct approach involves a comprehensive and systematic review of the identified weaknesses. This entails not only immediate remediation of the specific client onboarding issues, but also a broader assessment of the firm's overall AML/CTF policies, procedures, and training. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the root causes of the audit findings, demonstrates a commitment to regulatory compliance, and aims to prevent future occurrences. It aligns with the principles of robust risk management and the regulatory expectation that firms maintain effective systems and controls to combat financial crime. Specifically, it reflects the proactive stance required by the regulatory framework, which mandates ongoing monitoring and enhancement of AML/CTF defenses. An incorrect approach would be to dismiss the audit findings as minor or isolated incidents without proper investigation. This failure would be a direct contravention of regulatory expectations, which require firms to take all audit findings seriously and implement appropriate corrective actions. Another incorrect approach would be to implement superficial changes that do not address the underlying systemic issues. This would be ethically unsound and would likely result in repeated findings in future audits, potentially leading to significant regulatory sanctions. Furthermore, focusing solely on immediate client onboarding without reviewing the broader AML/CTF framework would be a failure to adopt a holistic risk-based approach, which is a cornerstone of effective financial crime prevention. Professionals should approach such situations by first understanding the full scope and implications of the audit findings. This involves a thorough risk assessment to determine the potential impact on the firm and its clients. Subsequently, a clear action plan should be developed, prioritizing remediation efforts based on risk. This plan should involve relevant stakeholders, including compliance, operations, and senior management. Regular monitoring and reporting on the progress of remediation are crucial to ensure effectiveness and demonstrate accountability to both internal governance and external regulators. The decision-making process should be guided by the firm's ethical obligations and the specific requirements of the applicable regulatory framework, always erring on the side of caution when financial crime risks are identified. Question 18. The assessment process reveals that a senior analyst at PACS Group may have engaged in a practice that appears to contravene market conduct regulations. The analyst's actions were observed by a junior colleague who has reported their concerns to management. This information has not yet been verified, and the potential implications for PACS Group and its clients are significant. What is the most appropriate immediate course of action for PACS Group management? Option A. Initiate a discrete internal investigation to gather further facts and assess the validity of the concerns before considering any external reporting. Option B. Advise the junior colleague to disregard their concerns and not to mention the matter to anyone. Option C. Immediately report the suspicion to the relevant regulatory authority, providing all details of the junior colleague's report. Option D. Discuss the analyst's alleged conduct with other clients of PACS Group to gauge their experiences and gather corroborating evidence. The correct answer is A. Initiate a discrete internal investigation to gather further facts and assess the validity of the concerns before considering any external reporting. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for PACS Group employees due to the inherent conflict between client confidentiality and the need to report potential regulatory breaches. The assessment process has uncovered information that, if true, could have significant implications for PACS Group's regulatory standing and client trust. The professional challenge lies in navigating the delicate balance between upholding client privacy, which is a cornerstone of the financial services industry, and fulfilling the obligation to report suspected misconduct to the relevant authorities, as mandated by regulatory frameworks. This requires careful judgment to avoid both over-reporting, which could damage client relationships and be seen as a breach of confidentiality, and underreporting, which could lead to regulatory sanctions and reputational damage for PACS Group. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough, internal investigation to gather sufficient evidence and context before escalating the matter. This aligns with the principles of due process and responsible reporting. PACS Group, like any regulated entity, has a duty to investigate credible concerns internally. This allows for a more informed decision on whether a formal report is warranted, ensuring that reports are not frivolous or based on incomplete information. Such an approach respects client confidentiality by not prematurely disclosing sensitive information and allows PACS Group to take appropriate internal remedial actions if necessary. This is ethically sound as it prioritizes accuracy and fairness, and it is regulatorily compliant by demonstrating a proactive approach to compliance and risk management, which is often a requirement for firms operating under strict regulatory oversight. Incorrect approaches analysis. Immediately reporting the suspicion to the regulator without any internal investigation is an incorrect approach. This failure to investigate internally could be seen as a breach of client confidentiality if the suspicion turns out to be unfounded or based on a misunderstanding. It also bypasses the firm's own compliance procedures and may lead to unnecessary regulatory scrutiny, potentially damaging PACS Group's relationship with the regulator. Furthermore, it demonstrates a lack of due diligence and an abdication of the firm's responsibility to manage its own risks and investigate potential issues before involving external bodies. Ignoring the information and taking no action is also an incorrect approach. This directly violates the regulatory obligation to report suspected breaches of regulations. It exposes PACS Group to significant regulatory penalties, fines, and reputational damage. Ethically, it represents a failure to uphold professional standards and a disregard for the integrity of the financial markets. This inaction could be interpreted as complicity or negligence, leading to severe consequences for both the individuals involved and the firm. Sharing the suspicion with other clients or external parties without proper authorization is a severe breach of client confidentiality and professional ethics. This action not only jeopardizes the client relationship, but also exposes PACS Group to legal action and regulatory sanctions for mishandling sensitive information. It demonstrates a profound lack of judgment and a disregard for the fundamental principles of trust and discretion that underpin the financial services industry. Professional reasoning. Professionals at PACS Group should adopt a structured decision-making process when faced with such situations. This process should begin with a confidential assessment of the information received. If the information suggests a potential regulatory breach, the next step is to initiate a discrete internal investigation involving the appropriate compliance and legal teams. This investigation should aim to gather facts, understand the context, and assess the credibility of the suspicion. Based on the findings of the internal investigation, a decision should be made, in consultation with senior management and legal counsel, on whether a report to the regulator is necessary. If a report is required, it should be factual, objective, and submitted in accordance with regulatory guidelines. Throughout this process, maintaining client confidentiality and adhering to internal policies and procedures are paramount. Question 19. Research into a potential breach of market abuse regulations by a client of PACS Group has surfaced concerning information that, if true, could have significant implications. A junior analyst within PACS Group has discovered this information through their regular client interaction. What is the most appropriate immediate course of action for the junior analyst to take to ensure compliance with PACS Group's internal policies and relevant regulatory frameworks? Option A. Immediately report the suspicion to the relevant regulatory authority, providing all details gathered. Option B. Discuss the findings with a trusted senior colleague in another department to gauge their opinion. Option C. Conduct a discreet, independent investigation to gather more concrete evidence before informing anyone. Option D. Document the findings meticulously and report them directly to the PACS Group Compliance Department. The correct answer is A. Immediately report the suspicion to the relevant regulatory authority, providing all details gathered. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for PACS Group employees due to the inherent conflict between client confidentiality and the need to address potential regulatory breaches. The firm's reputation and the trust of its clients are at stake, necessitating a careful and compliant response. The challenge lies in balancing the duty of confidentiality with the obligation to report suspected misconduct, all while adhering strictly to the PACS Group's internal policies and the relevant regulatory framework. The correct approach involves a thorough internal investigation, guided by the firm's compliance department and legal counsel, to gather sufficient evidence before any external reporting. This approach is professionally sound because it respects the principles of due process and avoids premature accusations. It aligns with regulatory expectations that firms should have robust internal procedures for handling suspected misconduct. Specifically, under the PACS Group's internal guidelines and the overarching principles of regulatory oversight, assuming a UK/CISI jurisdiction for this exam, a firm has a duty to investigate credible allegations internally first. This allows for a controlled and informed decision on whether and how to escalate to the regulator, thereby minimizing unnecessary disruption and protecting individuals from unfounded allegations. An incorrect approach would be to immediately report the suspicion to the regulator without conducting an internal investigation. This failure breaches the duty of confidentiality owed to the client and potentially the employee, and it could lead to regulatory sanctions for the firm for failing to follow its own internal procedures and for making unsubstantiated allegations. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the suspicion due to fear of repercussions or to avoid conflict. This inaction is a direct violation of the firm's ethical and regulatory obligations to maintain market integrity and to report potential breaches. It exposes PACS Group to significant regulatory penalties and reputational damage. A third incorrect approach would be to discuss the suspicion with colleagues outside of the designated compliance or legal channels. This constitutes a breach of confidentiality and could prejudice any subsequent investigation, creating further ethical and regulatory issues. Professionals facing such situations should employ a structured decision-making process. First, they must identify the potential regulatory and ethical obligations involved. Second, they should consult the firm's internal policies and procedures, particularly those related to whistleblowing, investigations, and reporting. Third, They should seek guidance from the compliance department or legal counsel to ensure their actions are compliant and appropriate. Finally, they must act with integrity and diligence, prioritizing the firm's regulatory standing and ethical commitments. Question 20. Cost-benefit analysis shows that implementing a new, less expensive data storage solution could significantly reduce PACS Group's operational expenses. However, this solution has not been previously vetted for its compliance with the specific data retention and security protocols mandated by the relevant regulatory bodies governing PACS Group's operations. Which approach should PACS Group prioritize when evaluating this proposed change? Option A. Focus primarily on the projected cost savings and implement the solution, with a plan to address any compliance issues that may arise post-implementation. Option B. Conduct a thorough impact assessment to evaluate the proposed solution's compliance with all applicable data retention, security, and privacy regulations, and assess potential client data risks before making a decision. Option C. Proceed with the implementation of the new solution immediately to realize cost savings, assuming that standard industry practices will ensure compliance. Option D. Seek client consent for the change based on the cost-saving benefits, without a detailed regulatory compliance review, as client approval supersedes regulatory concerns. The correct answer is B. Conduct a thorough impact assessment to evaluate the proposed solution's compliance with all applicable data retention, security, and privacy regulations, and assess potential client data risks before making a decision. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because PACS Group is considering a significant operational change that could impact its compliance posture and client trust. The decision requires a nuanced understanding of regulatory obligations and ethical considerations beyond mere financial projections. The core of the challenge lies in balancing potential cost savings with the imperative to maintain data integrity and client confidentiality, which are foundational to PACS Group's regulatory standing. The correct approach involves a comprehensive impact assessment that prioritizes regulatory compliance and client impact. This approach is correct because it aligns with the fundamental principles of data protection and client service expected of firms operating under the specified regulatory framework. Specifically, it necessitates a thorough review of how the proposed change affects PACS Group's adherence to data privacy laws, reporting requirements, and contractual obligations to clients. By proactively identifying and mitigating risks to compliance and client trust, this approach upholds the firm's ethical duty of care and its commitment to regulatory standards. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on cost reduction without adequately considering regulatory implications would fail to meet the firm's obligations. This would constitute a regulatory failure by potentially leading to breaches of data protection laws, inadequate reporting, or non-compliance with industry-specific regulations. Ethically, it would demonstrate a disregard for client confidentiality and data security, eroding trust and potentially leading to reputational damage and legal repercussions. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes speed of implementation over thoroughness would also be professionally unacceptable. This could result in overlooking critical compliance requirements or failing to implement necessary safeguards, thereby exposing PACS Group to regulatory penalties and client dissatisfaction. The ethical failure here is a lack of due diligence and a failure to act in the best interests of both the firm and its clients. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured risk assessment framework. This framework should begin with identifying all potential impacts of the proposed change, including operational, financial, regulatory, and reputational. Subsequently, each identified risk should be evaluated for its likelihood and potential severity. Mitigation strategies should then be developed and implemented, with a strong emphasis on ensuring that all actions remain within the bounds of the relevant regulatory framework and ethical guidelines. Continuous monitoring and review are also crucial to adapt to any unforeseen consequences or changes in the regulatory landscape.